Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Dispatches. I have not done a audio podcast in quite a while. There's a reason for that, but I'm with a special friend, special guest who I have not seen in approximately a decade, and that is photographer, artist, metal worker, traveler, adventurer, tourer of the equator, Monique Stauder. How are you, Monique?
I'm doing great.
It's been, I think, a decade.
At least a decade.
And my original intention here, people, was to do a video interview with Monique. But the problem is, because Monique's life is the way Monique's life is and has been, I would have had to have shot 10 or 12 hours of video to make this work because her life is too interesting. It really is the case of being faced with, we need to do this audio because we're probably going to talk about so many different things. But the side trivia thing here, which you might not even know, I thought about this last night. I think you are the person who turned me on to Miles Davis.
No way.
Yeah, because when you had an apartment in Paris,
yeah,
and my wife and I came over to go to Perpignan, and we stopped in Paris on the way to see you, and you had Kinda Blue, Miles Davis playing.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
And that's probably, since that time frame, is the album I've listened to more than any other album by far.
That's cool.
Yeah, no, that's one of my Monique Stauder memories. And so, as I said in the intro, well, how would you even describe yourself now if I didn't know you and I met you and said, Monique, what do you do?
Visual artist.
Okay.
Yeah, because everything visual. I'm a creator. I love to create. I've always created since I was little. I never went. All my academics, it was never about the art, but I've always loved the arts, and it was only until after with my thesis work that I combined photography that it actually then took off in that way. But then after my son was born in 2010. I just slowed down and shifted gears, and then I've always was curious about welding and metalworking. And then it's shifted to that, and then, yeah, it'll never stop. I mean,
the chameleon. But you had
exactly.
a lot of your creative life was based around photography, but how you came to photography is an interesting story, which we touched on just hanging out last night and talking about this, which was you were headed towards a double master's in international relations and history. You were going to school in Switzerland. You had your thesis project to do, which you thought was going to be one thing, and then it took a right turn. And explain this story, because it's a pretty interesting photography origin story.
Well, just to back up a little bit, so I went to, I was a year at Boston University and then 3 years at Boulder for undergrad. And that's when I dabbled into photography. I took a few photography courses, and I loved it. But then I went to Switzerland to do graduate work, and a very conservative institute. And my professor, who was saying I wanted to do something on Kashmir. I was interested in ethnic nationalism. And then he's like, well, have you ever considered Sri Lanka?
Of course.
Of course. And so I did research on it, and I said, if I'm going to spend 6 months of my life doing research, I want to go there. I want to be there on the ground. But I didn't want to study, the cycle. The idea was the cycle of failed peace negotiations over, 2 or 3 decades. And I just wanted to go. And so I had that idea, and to kind of analyze and interview different people who are on the Tamil side and on the Sinhalese side. And then after a couple months of just, banging my head against the wall, I was like, this isn't going anywhere. This isn't interesting. I'm still dealing with statistics, and I want to put a face to the situation. And across the street of the Center of Ethnic Studies was Médecins Sans Frontières. And I was like, wow, here's an international humanitarian organization making an inhumane situation humane. What if I could document their work in the field and get firsthand information, on the ground of what, and I did research, of MSF just in general on how it started in the 60s after the Biafra incident or situation in Africa. And I convinced my professor, this institute, that I could use photos. And I had my old FM2 Nikon camera, and I just, and I had my Swiss passport. So I'm Swiss American, and I used my Swiss passport to get across. They said, sure, you can come and document our work, but you have to get to our places all by yourself. And I'm like, okay. And so I had my Swiss passport, and everybody thought I worked for the Red Cross, because like, who is this Western girl? I was in my 20s at the time, so yeah. And I was able to get in. I was a chameleon, and took pictures, and because I was in the Northeast, and it was really hard for Westerners, regular journalists at that time, to get into these places, Reuters asked me to take some pictures. And so that was the beginning.
Wow, so that's your first stringer job was Reuters in Sri Lanka.
Exactly.
And so you had an old FM2 and probably 20 rolls of film, and
exactly. No, maybe 40 rolls.
40 rolls of film. And for those of you who don't know, with the Médecins Sans Frontières, that's Doctors Without Borders.
Yes.
in the States. That's how we refer to them. Because I had a little dance with MSF years ago after I'd left Cambodia, and they were going to send. I went to Cambodia for somebody else, but then MSF in LA was like, "Hey, can you go back and do such and such?" But my experience with them was a little funky. Was it a warm reception from their side, or was
What year was it?
96.
Oh, in 96. It was warm. I think so this was in 91,
Okay,
92.
okay. Yeah.
So it was before that they were, well, the doctors on the ground were amazing, were wonderful. And even the head people in Colombo were also very welcoming. They're like, yeah, sure, great. They were much welcoming. But then I'll have to say then, as a professional photographer, when I went back in 97, they were ice. They were cold. They're like, how, they didn't welcome me at all, nor did the UN or UNHCR or the Red Cross, anybody after, because I wasn't a graduate student, I was, a journalist, and they just gave me the cold shoulder.
Oh, that's probably why.
And I think they've had probably gotten burned, through that period of 5 or 6 years, and they're just like, we're not going to, It's a touch and go type of thing.
Yeah, I think it is, and I think the leader of the country project is always a key ingredient, and then there's the bureaucratic side of the big city organizations like LA that's sending teams into the field, and that's who I was interfacing with, and I didn't know them, and they didn't know me, and it was just kind of a weird thing. But so you basically went from studying these master's degrees, which had nothing to do with photography, into stringing in the field with a camera for Reuters in the middle of the Tamil Tiger, and this was what was happening in Sri Lanka at that time.
Well, it was, it was a full-on war. I mean, the Tamil Tiger, there was a lot of splintered, rebel groups, but the Tamil Tigers had pretty much started killing off all of those. And, there were, bombings, random bombings, and there was, there's troop movements, and, it was an active war. Yeah, for sure.
And that was the first time you went, and then you went back again in 96, 97, but we're going to talk about that later, because that was the whole adventure in itself.
So after spending 6 months with these international organizations, I was like, this is not for me, conflict resolution. I want to sit everybody down and discuss it and move on with life. It's like, but I loved being where history was being made right at that moment. And I was just, I was doing photography that I loved, and I was like, well, this is great. This is what I'm going to do. And so a humanitarian news journal in Geneva asked me, from my work that I did in in Sri Lanka, would you go to East Timor for us? So I was there during Shanana Guzmau's trial. So it was so that was in 93. And then that, but in between then was that where I went back to Indiana, where I was born.
Yes, Hoosiers.
And the Hoosiers. And I talked to Chip Murray at the Indianapolis Star, and I showed him my work, because I was like, I want to become a photojournalist. This is what I want to do. I finally was like, this is it.
What was the moment that you said that? Was it
in Sri Lanka?
In Sri Lanka.
In Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
I was like, this is, one, it was addictive, but it was everything that I loved. I was like, I was being there where history was being made, on the site, documenting what was happening. And I think when you go into conflicts, and from a historian, because my undergrad, I was a history major, it's like it was so important to have that historical background, to understand all the parties to the conflict and understand what they've gone through, like back up 40, 50, 100 years to really understand the evolution of a conflict. And that really helps as a
That
photographer.
seems like the perfect set of ingredients for photojournalism as a history major with a international
Exactly.
studies degree on top of that, a master's degree on top. That's a very unique foundation for somebody going into that field. But the extent of your photography training when you start stringing for Reuters
Nothing.
is your
For
UC Boulder.
UC Boulder. I mean, it was fine art.
Which is a party school, by the way.
Right, it was photography 101. I remember doing black and whites of abandoned cars and and different things.
Which is very popular now.
And then I was my brother at that time was living in Honduras, and then I would took pictures of in Roatan and in other places in Honduras, and came back and then I took it the next year. I took fine art printing. But I just was the whole thing. I just what was interesting. My photography professor took a historical perspective on photography, and so I was hooked. So here I was learning about photography, not just in the actual mechanics of it, but I learned about the history, the evolution of photography, and then just watching the magic happening in the darkroom and just falling in love with everything. So it was just kind of like, but I was like, how can I make a living at this? This isn't going to happen. So I
never ask yourself that.
I know, right? I put that aside.
Yeah, that's always a deadly question. But Chip Murray did something for you.
He did.
That he exposed you to something, and then also maybe pulled some strings behind the scenes. Tell us about that, because that's
So I think the cutoff date for the Eddie Adams workshop,
which is
a weekend workshop in upstate New York, which was founded by Eddie Adams, who took the Pulitzer Prize winning photograph in 1968 of the execution of the Viet Cong in the streets of Saigon.
Which you have a print of in your office.
Which I have a print of, yes. He would get all of his, Vietnam War correspondent, buddies, and they put together this workshop, and it's 100 students, 50 professionals that have had less than 2 years experience, and 50 students who are still in like photo school or photojournalism or fine art or whatever. You have to submit a portfolio. They choose you. It's free, and for 4 days, and then you're assigned a top director of photography and a top photojournalist, well-established, and you set up 10 teams of 10. And you have an assignment for the weekend. And then you're showing work and you're talking. So I was with Michelle Stevenson of Time magazine and Carol Guzzi of the Washington Post, and they're both just amazing individuals.
That is like power. For those of you out there in the audience who don't know who those people are, look them both up. I mean, Carol Guzzi's still shooting and still out there.
Amazing. She's an amazing photographer.
That is a power duo. I went to Eddie Adams twice, just for everyone to know. I went when I worked for Eastman Kodak, and I did not go as a participant. I went as a van driver, which is as sexy as it sounds. I was driving a team of 10 around, and there's a lot of backstories which I'm not going to go into now, but it was quite the experience. But Eddie launched, and when I say Eddie, I mean the Eddie Adams Workshop. Eddie launched a lot of people, and it got a lot of people noticed, and it was almost like a backdoor into the industry in a way.
It takes 2 years off of knocking on doors in New York City with all the editors. You established, there was like 11 o'clock club, 11 p.m. after everything was done,
right.
And you showed your portfolio. And so you had all these amazing photographers and editors looking at your work, giving you feedback. And it was just, you're just like adrenaline. You're just like, wow. And
that's right. There was no sleep.
No sleep. And then
time.
let alone, and then a little bit of partying and yeah.
A little bit. That was, you're being kind. There was some shenanigans.
And so then I went back then. I had such a great time. I went back on the black team like for 4 or 5 years after that.
And the black team is the team that helps organize the rest of the teams.
Right. And they're basically the grunt work, like mowing the grass, getting things ready also for this weekend too.
And so, just so people know, Eddie Adams, like as Monique said, it's on a farm in upstate New York, and it's it's a beautiful compound of buildings. And there's a theater where at night the photographers who've been invited in as instructors and participants show their work. And I saw some of the best presentations I've ever seen in my life in photography at the Eddie Adams Workshop, even though I was miserable and sleep deprived as a van driver. But it just was a memorable thing, and it's still
Gordon
going.
Parks was there when I was there,
wow.
And Carl Maiden, and all these legends too. And then to hear them speak and to tell their stories, is just phenomenal.
And so from that, you had your two team leaders, Michelle Stevenson, and you badgered her.
I badgered her I said, I'm going to come back. I'm going to get published in time. She's like, okay, be in the right place at the right time. And I have no doubt that we'll publish you one day. And so I did some stringing for AFP in Honduras for the elections.
Which is Agence France Presse.
Agence France Presse. And then I was following the news, and I was like, I'm either going to go to Haiti or Mexico for elections. And I was in Miami, and I saw in the Miami Herald this bar graph, like 100, 350, 1,500 balseros, boat refugees leaving Cuba. And I'm like, this is a story. This is what I'm on. Forget Haiti, forget Mexican or like the elections in Mexico. And I talked my way on with the Hermanos al Rescate, which is Brothers to the Rescue, this Cuban-American organization that would just drop supplies down off of their little Cessna planes, basically. And I talked my way, and I call Michelle, and I said, I'm going to Cuba. I think you're going to, and she's like, oh my God, you have aerial shots of these little boats in the middle of the straits, of the Florida Straits. I'm like, yes. She's like, send the film. And so I FedEx, this is back in the film, this is in
shooting
1994.
film and FedExing film.
Yeah. And I said, I'm not going to wait. She's like, listen, we'll give you $1,000, put you on a retainer. Whatever you shoot in Cuba, send it directly to us. So you had to find people in Havana to actually carry the film back to New York, which was a whole different.
Yeah, I want to touch on that briefly before we move on to the rest of the story. But what Monique's talking about, and maybe I've mentioned this before on a podcast or a video or something, but at the time, if she's on assignment in Cuba and she's working, the only way to get that film out, there was no FedEx. The only way to get the film out was to physically go to the airport, find someone who's on a flight to Miami or New York, a stranger, approach them and say, hey, you don't know me, but will you carry this bag of film, and somebody will meet you at the airport when you get off the plane. And people did it.
And they did it. It's amazing. I know. Now it's totally such a different beast.
Oh, there's no way
nobody would do it now.
No, nobody would know. If you even showed up at the airport and tried, you'd get arrested or tased or something. So no, it was a completely different era. I absolutely love that. That's what the logistics were at the time. I think there's something romantic about the whole thing.
Yeah.
And so tell us what happens with the
so they run a double-page spread.
Time
does of the little boat in the dire straits, and then the next week I get a half a page of a balsero jumping off the land onto this little raft, basically most likely to his death. And I was like, and then with that in my portfolio, that just sent me off. So then I had the next 10 years of running around, trying to find, Michelle Stevenson helped me with try to find an agency, but I was kind of at that kind of end part when those photo agencies were kind of like at our last leg.
Hurrah.
And I was based in Paris at the time. And then, so it was kind of like it was basically at the end of the day, you still had to pitch your own story, and they usually would say no. And so you're just like, I'm passionate about this, I'm going to do it. And so since I had done my work in Sri Lanka, I knew Sri Lanka. I had a pass from the Tamil Tigers. I was like, I'm going to go back, and I want to do a story on the female Tamil Tigers.
And the Tamils are the main rebel group in Sri Lanka.
Yes.
And were they was it like the FARC in Colombia, where they had a section of the country that was theirs, that was under Tamil control?
Yes.
And there was a front line where they were battling with the government troops.
Yes.
And you had to get past that front line.
Yes. And so I approached as a PhD student, which was not true. And then when I got to the other side, but that's when I got the cold shoulder from the UN and Red Cross, and they're like, how did you get over the line? And I was like, well, I was here before, and I have this thing. But then I sat almost for 24 hours in the Tamil Tiger office. I was like, I'm not going to leave. I was like, you're getting no Western press. I'm not leaving. So basically at 3 o'clock in the morning, they're like, okay, she's not going to leave. What are we going to do with her? And I go on this screaming, Jeep jungle drive for a couple hours to a base to where there was one camp of the female tigers, and they gave me 24 hours with them. And I got these photos. And so then it was another scoop, and I was able, and that time, and so
And then how'd
Asia
you-
and Time magazine ran those, and Asia Week
Asia
and a few
Week.
others.
How did you get out?
Well, so at that time, it was a low photo pack, and there was like a compartment that you could put your film, because I was still shooting, film. I stuck it in the back of and I just had my pack, and I always carried a yo-yo. So crossing, I'd always do my yo-yo.
A distraction.
A distraction.
So in your pack, you had like a secret compartment.
Yeah.
With
yeah,
film.
With film.
And then was it danger from the government side of like getting shot trying to come back to that side?
No, not shot, but kind of like you just kind of appear, and they're like,
Yeah.
who are you? And they basically, I walked like the last mile to go back. They're like, this is where we end, and now you got to walk. And I'm like, okay, is this
God, that's got to
mind?
be. Yeah, that's my first thought is the mind.
Oh yeah, no. So I stayed on a path. Let's say.
Smart.
Yeah.
Yeah. Don't stray.
Don't stray off a path.
And the yo-yo, I've never heard that, but it's such a good thing.
It is such a good thing, and I think I probably still have it somewhere. It's probably all tangled up, but it was like, so it's like conversation. It's like, you have to be that fly on the wall, and you don't take it out. And I've had amazing experiences, but there was a point where then after like almost 10 years where you're going runner and then not getting anywhere, like not really not really finding a good agency, or them not getting you assignments, and you get worn out. I did a lot of work for the Christian Science Monitor, which was great, and they let me do some writing. And then I realized that I think it was in the Nubian Mountains in Sudan, where I was like, okay, nobody wants this story, and I've gotten these things and these images, and I was like, I think I need to switch gears. So I went back to New York City. I applied to the film school at NYU, a summer program, intensive filmmaking course. And because I gave myself 3 years in Paris, like I'm either going to break into the French media mafia, or I'm not, or I'm leaving. I got to turn the page.
Explain that, because the French media mafia is a very specific thing to that region, and coming from, you're a Swiss American, but you're still American.
Still American. No,
Yeah.
like when I'm in Europe, I'm American. When I'm in America, I'm European.
Yeah.
It's a very funny situation. And then that's same with my photography. In the photojournalist world, I'm an artist. In the art world, I'm a photojournalist.
Yeah,
So
it's
like,
hard.
I hate it when people want to pigeonhole you. It's just like,
Well, and the French media mafia, you have American in your title, and it's a major strike.
and
Like,
it's, even with, double page spread from time. I mean, they're courteous or whatever, they're interested, but then they're not going to, I got no assignment. But then I found out, like through SIPA, and somebody else had some work that I did of a royal wedding in Jodhpur, and it just showed up in the Figaro. And I'm like, I didn't know that, how did they get my work?
Yeah.
Anyway, it's crazy. And I just,
10 years of hustle.
So 10 years of hustle. I go to NYU. It was a 5 or 6 week course over the summer. I cat sat from somebody who had an apartment on the Lower East Side, and I fell back in love with why I picked up the camera in the first place. So it was old Aeroflex. You learned how to edit on an old Steamback. You had a battery pack. You're going around. You had to produce 5 short films in that time, 3-minute films, but like old school. And my last film was called No Beginning, No End. And it was very artsy and poetic. And I loved it. And I go back to Paris, and I'm like, okay, what am I going to do? And and at that time, Stanley Green was a great friend and mentor and a wonderful person. And I was talking to him, and he's just like, well, maybe you should, whatever. He was giving me advice. And then I woke up because it was really on my mind. I really had to make a decision because I wasn't making money, and I was, it's feast and famine for 10 years. So I had a dream. Sounds so funny. I had a dream. And I was like, what is the largest geographical circle known to man? It was the equator. And I was like, boom, this is what I'm going to do. I packed everything up from Paris back to my parents' farm in Indiana, and I went to the Institut Géographique National, which is like the equivalent of National Geographic in Paris, and bought like all the topographical maps around the equator.
Around the entire planet.
Around the entire planet. And it's from the equator to like 5 degrees. So I cut off everything. I only wanted 1 degree north and 1 degree south. I was like, this is going to be my red thread, my zone. And I'm just going to, and this was in 2000, I'm going to document at the turn of the millennium just life around the Earth's underbelly.
But back up 1 second.
Okay.
Because there's a lot there. During the 10 years of Hustle, there is not like a country, a region, a place in the world where you don't have a story from.
Yeah, I have a few.
I mean, whether it's Chile or Honduras or driving from wherever, Argentina to Alaska, or wherever, all across Africa, lived in Thailand, lived in the Congo, which we're going to get to in a bit. But underneath the Equator Story, which became Latitude Zero, which is your book.
Yep.
Forward by Paul Theroux, correct?
Yes.
Which is a whole nother thing that I can't even imagine. And I have a little Paul Theroux story that I think is kind of funny. But what's interesting to me is the way you came to photography was not, gee, these cameras are really cool. I love the techie side. This is great. There was an underlying theme from the beginning about putting a human face on a story about, the whatever geopolitical thing that you were working on. The equator came from a circle.
Came from a circle, came from this little art film that I did from in NYU, the last one called No Beginning, No End. And it just was so poetic. And I was like, I don't want an editor anymore saying, I want this image or that image. I was like, I just want to document life with a capital L around the center of the world at this like historical turning point, 2000, that was that. It was just like
Y2K, we're all going to die.
Y2K, right? Everybody was going to die. Everybody was like, no, ding dong. So I left. I had a couple $1,000s in my pocket. It was basically a life with no keys. I had no bills. I had no responsibility. I had no apartment rent. I had no bills. Nothing. And I used a lot of my free air miles. And I started in Brazil. And then I just was chasing the sun. I was just working my way westward, and I kept going. And after South America section was done, I regrouped, tried to get a little more money, kind of, and so I was freelancing along the way. And in Colombia, I stayed 6 months because I was getting a lot of work. It was like Plan Colombia was there, and everybody wanted to know what the FARC was doing. And so it kind of dictated to, like, if I was getting work, I would stay, but I would only focus. I was shooting in black and white.
And you were shooting with a Rolleiflex?
I was shooting with a Rolleiflex and my Nikon gear, and but not digital, and a Leica.
And how, like, logistically challenging was traveling with all that film? And
it was hard. So you always had to have a base. And then you worked out from there, and then you would just go off with a backpack or something, And I started developing it during the time, like in Colombia, through your friend Scott.
Oh yeah, Scott
He had
Dalton.
Somebody who developed, and he ruined my film with the FARC.
No way.
I was so upset. I was like, you got to be kidding. I was like, you did that on purpose. It's like, that guy did that on purpose. He didn't want that out. But no, I'm kidding. So then I decided, okay, I'm not gonna develop any of that film if I wasn't on assignment, and just keep it. And then when I went back to New York or wherever, like after South America, I went to a friend's place in Mexico City, and developed the film there, and then work on, and then store it, somewhere else.
Even that.
Oh, even then it was crazy. And everybody's like, it was just kind of still, this is, digital film cameras were coming out, but they were so heavy. And, I did get a digital camera, but not for this. That was after Latitude Zero, after I'd finished that. But yeah, but I loved the medium format. And my photographer friend in Mexico, he gave me his Rolly, and he's like, "You're gonna fall in love with this." Yeah. And I did. And it's, as we were talking before, it's a whole different dynamic dealing with people. You can just sit there and relax, and it's on your lap, and you can have a conversation. It's not like in your face with the camera. And but it's the thing with photography. For me, it's like 5-10% technique and 90% soul. And I think I do that with everything. I'm self-taught pretty much with photography and with my art, whether it's the welding or whatever. You have to have that passion. You got to have that, and you want to be, and the curiosity about wanting to hear people's story.
Yeah.
And having the patience to be there. Maybe it might take 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, but having the patience to just sit it out and be there. And so, yeah, and it's hard. Like, you can't do that if you have a lot of bills waiting for you to be paid. So it was definitely a unique part of my life.
I think the C word, I think curiosity is definitely at the top of the list for anybody who's like you that's out in the world.
And compassion.
The wanted to know. Compassion is another one.
Yeah.
But I also think, too, for you, they're the underlying, again, this is not a photographic, to me, it's not a photographic message. It's an underlying message, and you're using photography to explain that underlying message. Whereas, there's plenty of photographers who are coming from just a different angle where it's much more about the individual, like the photo side. It's weird. And I think people are probably sick of hearing me say this, but I think photography today is better as a small part of a larger conversation than the conversation itself, because photography has become so ubiquitous, and the great deluge of imagery that we can't keep up with.
Yeah.
And so even if you're putting elite style imagery in front of people, getting that attention for people to focus on just the technical aspects of the photography, like, oh, that's great composition or great light, it's difficult.
Well, I know you're talking because of the generation of
I
kids
just think the world's changed,
Yeah.
and I think the attention span of all ages has changed. And I think back when we started, because you had to shoot film and the process was so slow, that getting attention for elite photography was more possible than it is today, because today people are just inundated all the time. And so to me, I'm not as interested really in the photography anymore. I'm interested in what the underlying story is, and if the people are using photography to tell that story, I'm all in. I'm interested.
Right.
But I don't necessarily look at it like I used to look at the old French photo magazine in 1992, where I'd pore over those images and I was just mesmerized by, like, how do I make images like that? The story was kind of lost in the genius of the photographer. And I think now I'm more flipped. And I think for you, you started with the foundational element. And I think that's what allowed you to make it through the 10 years of hustle and adapt and evolve and keep going, because the curiosity and the idea that these stories are out there and you want to tell these stories.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
And so let's see, you're 10 years of hustle, you've gone to the film school, and now you're starting on the equator, you've traveled around. How many years on that project?
It took 3 years, and with the Life Note Keys. So I did, yeah, 3 years, but then I had to go back because I had the story, because of East Timor situation, 10 years later, I couldn't go into Indonesia, and the equator in Asia is Indonesian archipelago. So I had to get in, and so that was really difficult to...
And why couldn't you get in?
So I was there. I went one time as a Swiss national and one time as an American national. And the second time I went back, I was dating an Australian guy. And I went back to Australia, and they found out that I had been there in East Timor. There's a huge Timorese refugee population in Australia. And the resistance, or whatever you want to call them, were like, you got to go back. And then there was this Australian filmmaker. He did Chile Hasta Cuando and all these different ones. So he seemed legit. And I'm like, and he was going to go with his 5-year-old son, and he was going to go back and recreate. He just wanted me to go and take stills of, the dress, the culture, the landscape, the house, because he was going to recreate East Timor in Australia and do a feature film.
Oh, okay, got it.
And he had ulterior motives, and I didn't know that. And so basically, to make a very long story short, he was kicked out, and I was kind of like slapped on the wrist saying, be careful who you travel with. But I had to leave. And so we had to sign a document in Bahasa Indonesian, and I'm like, and in English, I'm like, I don't know what I'm signing. I'm forced to being signed this. And so 10 years later, I arrive in Denpasar, and I'm in the computer, and they're like, sorry. So I couldn't even go to Singapore. I couldn't go. They sent me back to Guam on the next flight back to Guam. And I was like, livid. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And yeah, I could not get in. And so I was like, so I lost some time. I went to Asia because of the Timorese photos that I had. So no, at that time I was like, I'm not going to wait. I'm going to go on to Africa. So I can't. I'm just going to put Asia part
put it
on
on the back
hold.
burner.
And Maldives was too crazy expensive at the time to get to. I was like, because it's the southern part of the archipelago, and I was like, okay, I'm going to base myself in Nairobi and start on the eastern part of Africa, of the equator. And so like after that was done, I was back in DC. I went to the Indonesian embassy, and basically they were very nice, but they're like, you signed a thing saying that you were a danger to the state and you will always be on the blacklist.
Who knew that the Timorese computer system was so high tech?
It wasn't the Timorese, it was the internet. Never underestimate any country's intelligence.
Wow.
Security.
I'm impressed.
Yeah, I was like, wow. And so, but get this. So through my father's like business contacts, because I was in living in Hong Kong at the time in Asia, he contacted a man who had a daughter in San Francisco who my dad had helped. He's like, well, as a repay, let me help you. And he was based in Jakarta. So basically he gave the Ministry of Defense $100 and say, just let her have a 30-day visa. She will be good. She won't do, she's not going to go to Aceh. She's not going to cover anything. And I was like, no, it's more than a 1 degree. I'm not going to cover it. And so, and I was able, and so they're like, go to the embassy in Singapore, slip the guy, the 50 guy, he'll get a stamp. When you get into in Jakarta, they will, whatever. And it worked. Unbelievable.
Jesus.
I don't know how it worked. And to this day, my husband's so pissed off because he's like, I want to go to Indonesia and you can't.
You're like, yeah, I think I ruined that for us. And so you're still on the
Probably.
You're on the shit
I've
list.
never tried. I've never tried to go back, but I probably am.
I got banned from a Las Vegas hotel once, and I got back in years later. So their computer system sucked. I was not still in the system
because I said, what? Timor is independent now, and they did not like that. They're like,
yeah,
sorry, you're going back to Guam. But anyways, yeah. So I can't remember what was the train of thought.
3 years on the project.
So 3 years on the project.
How did you know when you were done?
Well, geographically, I had covered everything except the Maldives. So in 2003, then I went back I did the Indonesian for the 30 days. And then I was able to get into the Maldives for a week. So it was kind of frustrating. I mean, I would have liked to have done, but it was done. Yeah.
And so let's take the Maldives, for example. So you've got a small location, but difficult to get from island to island, right? So, and you have a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So what does a typical day look like on that project? Do you have a shot list when you fly in, or are you just flying by the seat of your pants when you get there?
Seat of my pants. I do a little research, and I have my maps and different symbols on the map. I'm like, that looks like an interesting, and then I do a little research and be like, well, there's a mine here. I'd like to cover this bauxite mine, or there's, whatever was happening at the time. And so in the Maldives, and luckily I had that geographic framework. Otherwise, you'd be all over the map. Like, oh my God, I can go in here and do this and that. And I only strayed out of the 1 degree north and south in Brazil and in Somalia because of either security situation or geographic. So like in Brazil, I went down the Amazon River and up. And so going down, you strayed out. Yeah, straight out, but yeah.
And in Somalia, it was just because it's Somalia.
Yeah, because I flew a cot flight into Mogadishu from Nairobi, and I got on with the British American Tobacco on a cigarette run to like 100 kilometers south, but I couldn't go south. Like I went all the way on the Kenyan border. I was going to go across into Somalia, and they're like, no,
you'll die.
You'll die. Don't do that. And even then at the border, at that refugee, I think it's called Luboy, there were, Syrian dentists and like all these really strange, not Kenyan people there. There was like in Ras Kamboni where that was like the hub of a lot of the militant, Islamists.
You just said I got a cot flight from Nairobi to Mogadishu, and to explain what cot is.
So cot is a mild hallucinogenic that the Somalians and other people in that kind of Horn of Africa are addicted to. You chew it, it's a leaf.
It's like a little bit, it's speed.
It's like, yeah, it's a little bit less. So like basically if you're in Mogadishu, you cannot have an interview after maybe 11 o'clock in the morning or 1 o'clock, because then you have people who are just completely stoned and they think that they're,
Invincible.
20 feet tall. And yeah, you just, there's no cognition going on. So.
And then also you said that you had also gotten in on a British tobacco flight into, and so when you...
Well, it wasn't their flight, it was a COT flight, but I had met the security officer of BAT in Nairobi through years before in 1999, and I kept up the contact, and he's like, oh, well, you'll need security. And so when I was there in Mogadishu, so I stayed at a hotel, and he's like, well, because I was like, well, I need to get as close as I can to the equator, and I'd like to see, and they're like, well, we're doing a cigarette run. We're going to, distribute some cigarettes. I'm like, this sounds cool. so I
like,
go down
I love
there.
Cigarettes.
And then at the same time, through other various contacts that I had made in Nairobi, there was an NGO in Merca that I wanted to interview, and I had some things to give to people, some relatives from Nairobi, Somalians. They said, well, can you please go to Merca? If you get there, can you give? And so that's what I did. And there was a Swiss lady who had worked at a hospital there for her own NGO, and I was like, oh, it should be really cool to interview and to document her work. Thinking about that guy in Gabon, who was that guy, the doctor?
Schweitzer?
Schweitzer.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, maybe she's like the Eastern version of the Schweitzer,
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's my time, it's like a whole other interview.
I was going to say.
But the thing is that basically I get these two Moroccan guys who are shooting for Abu Dhabi TV come there, and they're like, what are you doing here? And I'm like, wow, what are you guys?
Just hanging.
Just hanging. And I had my Pakistani pujami, and they're like, just act like, they're like, well, we're going to go interview like the ISIS equivalent that's hanging out here. And I'm like, they're just, act like you're, you can't speak, you can't hear, just come with us, and we'd just be quiet. And I'm like, okay, well, and then he was like, that sixth sense kicks in as like, I think I need to go back with these guys.
Yeah.
I was like, this is,
I'm pushing my luck.
I'm pushing my luck. And that Swiss lady was assassinated the next day. And I was on my Swiss passport. So there was a lot of controversy. Like, did they find out? Did they, I didn't do anything bad. I was just taking, pictures of.
Wow.
Yeah, it was crazy. So then I'm back, and yeah.
Just your East Africa experience. I mean, what you just went over in the last 5 minutes is so atypical, which is, again, why we're doing an audio podcast right now and not video, because there's just so much there that is outside the norms of what would be considered like a normal life. But this is the life that you had to do. You're doing and did you go to literally every single country on the equator?
Every single one.
Which is how many?
Even Sao Tome and Principe, I think it's 13, 14.
13 or 14 countries. And then, so now you're done. You're done shooting.
Yeah.
Where's all the film at this point?
So all the film was in New York, in New York City. So I did a lot of couch surfing in New York at that time. So I'm finished in 2003. I was like, I need to develop all this. I need to find a publisher, and so it took me from 2003 to 2010 to find a publisher.
I was going to say, you would
So I went through 3 different book maquettes, book things. And like different people were interested, and then they would say it, and then like, no, black and white, and it's too poetic, it's too artsy, or it's not like Madonna naked on the equator, or dogs, or, it was a hard sell, at that time. And I knew that, and I was like, I didn't want to do it. That I wanted to do it in black and white because I focus better on, or focus. It's gritty and it's soulful, and you have a different. I have a different mentality when I'm shooting in color or in black and white, which is funny. I mean, maybe that's old school. I don't know.
But the interesting thing to me is, you would think that when the principal photography is over, that the heavy lifting is done, and it's not. And in fact, it took you longer to find a publisher than it did for you to travel around the entire equator of the Earth, getting the imagery. And I think that that's a lesson for everybody out here, is that this publishing thing is not easy at all, especially when you're not conforming to what is economically most viable to the publisher. So
and almost all the publishers loved the work, loved it, and they're like, it's not a sell for us. You can't do it. And I understood that. And all my friends and colleagues were like, you got to go meet Martin in Amsterdam. He still has a heart for black and white projects, and that was in 2008. He's like, I want to publish this. This is great. And basically when I went through, first of all, I started with my Mexican friend who had a contact in Barcelona with these designers, and we did a beautiful book, and it was more of stream of consciousness. The idea was I wanted these images to be a flow, a continuum. There's no beginning or end to a circle, right? So I wanted it to have that idea. And it didn't work. It was big and bulky. And then I got hooked up with another designer in Vermont, and he had a lot of contacts, and he had his design firm in Chicago and did this. And I was just like, ew. I was like, this is not it was more like, it was like academic. And Martin looked at those things and he's like, ew. He's like, if you didn't show me. So what I had done is, so then when I was in New York, so I went through all my contacts. I Xeroxed all of them. I cut out every image, that tiny little image.
Oh, you went through your contact sheets.
I went through my contact sheets and I cut out all the images that I wanted. And I put 2 books together. So when you finish one book, you flip it over and another book starts. And I laid it out like I would, how I'd want it.
Yeah.
And he's like, that's what sold it. He's like, that is from your heart. That is from your soul. This is what I want to publish.
And it makes sense.
It makes sense.
Yeah,
and
the book that never ends.
Then the book that never ends. You just keep, and you can pick it up and look at it anywhere, and it's not a big, And he, had Tuan as a designer. He worked with 2 designers, and Tuan, it just worked the rhythmic magic, editing magic.
Tuan is, I don't think I've ever met him in person. He's universally beloved.
Yeah, and he is. And it's a wife-husband team, and they're great. They're awesome. And he did a beautiful job. And it was their printer in Germany. It's like, because it was a 2-book thing, it would have been too expensive to publish in Germany. But I was based in Bangkok at that time. And I was like, well,
of course, because that's one of the 500 places that you've been based in your life.
And I was like, there's published, printers in China. And so, Martin was like, oh, I'm not sure about that. And so, but we ended up going, and to and flown. And I was like pregnant at the time. I was like 8 months pregnant. We fly into Shenzhen, and I'm like getting I
might have my baby in China.
I might have my baby in Shenzhen. And they did it, and they knocked it out. And so my son and book came out. They're my twins at the same time. And then I did a TED Talk in Hong Kong. I talked at the Geographical Society, the Explorers Club in New York. And so there was a lot of great things, but it was fun.
So one of the things that's really interesting to me is Paul Theroux is involved, and he wrote a foreword or an introduction to the book.
So he wrote the first foreword, and then I had the idea of doing the 2 books in one. And I was like, and I recontacted him. I was like, could you write another foreword?
Oh.
He's like, don't push it. But he was really, so I met him on the Ecuadorian-Colombian border. He was wearing a Hawaiian shirt and this crazy hat. I was like, who is this gringo? Like, what the heck is he doing here?
Yeah.
I had just come across a Colombian, and the paramilitary group, had were out on exercises, and the FARC had blown up the pipeline there. So I was like dirty and exhausted, and I didn't want to talk to anybody, and I was just like,
and you run into Paul Theroux.
And I run into Paul Theroux, and I didn't know that. So we started talking. He seemed pretty, after talking, I realized he wasn't just, a tourist. A tourist.
Yeah.
And at the end, and he's like, "What's your name?" I'm like, "Monique Stauder." I'm like, "And you?" He's like, "Paul Theroux." And I'm like, "What?"
You're like, "Can you repeat that?"
The Patagonia Express and all these. I was like, "That's so cool," And he was super. And he has a frigate bird tattooed to his hand. And he's like, "Listen, when your next stop is the Pacific," and he wrote "Fresh Air Fiend," the kayaking all around the Pacific Islands. He's like, "If you need help." He's in between Cape Cod and Hawaii. He's like, if you stop through Hawaii, I'm like, okay, be careful what you ask for. I will show up. I will show up. Unfortunately, he wasn't there when I was going to Christmas Island, but we stayed in touch, and he wrote that Dark Star Safari, his journey from Cairo to Cape Town. He's like, and I get this random email. He's like, hey, Equatorial Gypsy, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm based in Kinshasa now. He's like, do you have any photos in Uganda on the equator? I want to try to use one of your photos for the book, for my book, Dark Star Safari. I was like, oh, that'd be awesome. That'd be great. And then in the end, the publisher didn't go with it, but we got back touch base again, and then he totally agreed. He's like, yeah, I'll write another forward. And so it was great. It was awesome.
So I was on an island 25 years ago, and I'm trying to get this image, and I'm in this cove, and I'm waiting, and I'm walking back and forth in the beach, and I look over, and I'm walking past a guy who's sitting on a folding beach chair in the surf. So the water's coming up to like his knees as he's sitting, and he has a yellow legal pad and a pen, and he's writing, but he's writing like page after page after page. Hawaiian shirt, sitting, and I'm just walking back and forth in front of him over this course of time waiting, and I looked at him, and I kept looking at him, and I was like, God, that almost looks like Paul Theroux, but there's no way that that's Paul Theroux. And so I'm just having this conversation in my head as I pass him like 20 times back and forth. I get my shot, I leave, and I'm telling a buddy of mine who lives on this same island in that same area. I was like, yeah, I swear to God, this guy looked like Paul Theroux. He's like, you idiot, that is Paul Theroux. He lives right up the hillside.
Oh, funny.
And so I was like, wow, I can't imagine, like, I think if you had not met him on the border in that situation, to reach out at a later date, cold call, like,
no way.
you probably never would have gotten near him.
No.
And so that is just so fortuitous that
synchronicity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. And so you get the book out, the book's printed. How many copies did you print?
I think they printed 2,500, 3,000.
Okay, which these days would be a
lot.
big run. Yeah,
it's a big run. And I think I have 1,000 copies. I have 500 here and 500 still. So like 1,000 sold.
Okay.
There wasn't much,
marketing.
Marketing. It came out like the Foreign Press Club in Bangkok and the Swiss Embassy did nice things in Bangkok because that's where I was. But and then there was the Paris Le Mois de Photo in Paris, and then there was a few something in Amsterdam, but it was all low. It was not. It was hard. It's been hard to sell. So,
but tell me why. I mean, I have my own reasons.
Even it won the award. The German edition won the award in Germany. This prestigious award. It won the silver award, and the PDN, it won, it won an award. Well, it hadn't been published, so they reneged on the first prize for the book, but then they gave me the first prize for like a photojournalism images that were from the book.
Wow.
So, yeah.
But why was the book such a thing for you? Why the book's a thing for all of us, but why when you're in the back of your head as you're traveling around the equator, before you started that project, in your mind, did you say, this is going to be a book?
Well, yeah, no, I wanted to do a book. I wanted to do, because I was tired, like the 10-year hustle, shuffle. I needed to slow down, and I wanted to do something from my heart, and I've always been an adventurer and a voyager, and it combined everything together. I was like, oh my God, Somalia, Congo, Colombia are on the equator. These are countries that I hadn't been to the 10 years before. And I was like, I could do this slowed down, not fast paced, and really take my time if I wanted to, or just hang out if I wanted to, because I had no bills, except my immediate expenses. And so, it was something in my mind. And then it's also in my mind to do a trilogy. So first they're like, the Tropic of Cancer, Tropic of Capricorn. That was like the initial idea. And then now it's morphed into something else. And now it's like more than 10 years later after it's been published, I'm like, okay, well, I've had a son, and I've been a wife and a mother, and I've gotten involved in other artistic endeavors.
But that book and those copies, even the ones that haven't sold, there's a permanence. There's a permanence. It's a testament, a testimony, and a permanent record of the world, the equator at that time.
Yeah.
And that's very different from the temporal kind of existence that we often have today, where even if something is brilliantly done, it can have a super short life cycle, a 2-day life cycle.
Totally.
But even it goes viral, and 2 days later, people are like looking for the next viral thing. Whereas this book is like it's a haunting of that part of your life, that time frame, and that history. And those books could end up in libraries. Those books can end up in collections. Those books are going to be around when you and I are dust.
Totally.
And there's something interesting about that.
Permanent,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where's all the film and all that stuff now?
In that closet.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
At least
hilarious.
it's nice and cool in the basement.
Yeah, no, this is like the perfect storage area.
Yeah.
Okay, so you had your son,
Yeah.
who's amazing. We had a good, nice, long conversation with him
Well,
last
hopefully,
night.
what I hope for him is that, he'll get the bug and maybe he will redo my journey in his own way and go on the equator and document it in whatever way, shape, or form. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah,
Like
that would be great.
Yeah.
20 years from now, he goes back
Exactly.
out and
Yeah.
hammers it out. So you're a mom, you have a son, you've moved from Bangkok, you've lived in Congo for a long time, in Kinshasa.
In Kinshasa, and so where I met my husband, a Belgian, who I met in early 2001 too, where I was in the Congo for the Equator trip, and where I met him. But I'm like, okay, yeah, he's cool, nice, wonderful, cute, good, like sexy, and like in the middle of nowhere.
You're like, I
listening
think I wanna move to the
classical music.
Congo.
I know. I'm like, wow. But I was like, you have a lot of, personal light issues that he had to deal with, and I was like, I'm on a mission, and I was just in the beginning. Had started. I had only done South America, and I still needed to do western part of Africa, So, but we kept in touch, and so we had this incredible romance for 6 or 7 years, and I'm like, I do love this guy. I was like, this is it. I was like, because it's like, do I want to continue this fast pace or just like, or no, do I want to turn the page? And yeah, and I finally was like, yeah, I had a dream, and we were like feeding each other applesauce. He's 11 years my senior, and I'm like throwing applesauce like with a spoon into his mouth, and we were like laughing hysterically. And I was like, I'm going to spend.
I don't know what that means.
I'm going to spend the rest of my life with this man. And then we got married. I was like, and within 2-3 months, we got married in the Bronx in the Botanical Gardens.
I mean, you're the only person I know who's lived in the Congo. And as an American, when you hear the word Congo, I just have, what I envision in my mind, which is probably completely inaccurate. But it's not the common thing that you hear people like, oh yeah, I live in Kinshasa. What was that like?
Well, I mean, I was also not actively looking for stories, but I would have fed a lot of people's stories because there was a lot going on. I did do a few things, but it's like, so because of my son, I had to stay in Kinshasa, where my husband was managed different plantations, so he was always out in the interior, which I had been to before. But so I was stuck. I was confined in Kinshasa. But so it's like, my son's growing up with, police and armed people running around the streets. And it's, you can't go walking. He didn't learn to ride a bike until he was, 6 years old, because it's just, you don't have the freedom of movement. It's different, but I always say, out of all the countries in Central Africa, the Congolese are really wonderful people. They love to laugh. Their music is great. They're really it's a special place on one hand, and they've been through the ringer. I mean, through the wars, and and I mean, Jesus, there's like so much.
And your son, who we had talked with last night, I mean, for his age, it's like you're talking to a sage. You're talking to an older man.
He grew up, they had it's like he saw no color, He grew up, he was with, Sunnis and Shias and Pakistanis and and every kind of African, country, it was like a model little UN. And what an amazing experience for him to have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just to be able to talk, and to different people. He throws into I remember we were on a vacation in Greece, and he goes up, there's this cute little girl. I'm like, Conrad, go talk to her, And he goes up to the parents, and he's like, hi, I'm Conrad. I was born in Bangkok and grew up in Congo, and I think your daughter is very cute.
No way.
And I'm like, okay, we're going to have to work on that.
Yeah, you're going to have to work on the pitch, dude. I mean, but the parents were probably like, oh.
But I know, but then, and they thought it was hysterical, luckily. And then they started playing, and it had so much, it was cute. It was really cute.
So, and you've moved out of the Congo. We're sort of embedded in the middle of Middle America now, at least for temporarily. But you've also, the transition from Bangkok, I mean, the last time I remember seeing you was in Paris all those years ago. So it was Paris and then Bangkok and then Congo, and you've lived a ton of other places around the world or spent extended periods of time in all those places. And now the latest evolution is you're here in the middle America for now. But you're also...
For our son's education.
Yeah. And so however long that takes, and then who knows where you're going to go after. But your work also transitioned majorly because you're walking into this house and seeing the sculptures out front. You have completely changed. You are doing metal sculptures, which are a blend of all kinds of things. But tell us how that came to be.
So there was a bank in Kinshasa called Trust Merchant Bank who had the second floor was an art gallery. And so when we arrived there in 2013, I was still trying to push my, latitude zero. And I was like, I want to try to sell the books and prints. And they gave me an amazing exhibit, the whole floor. I did the whole thing, and it was all connected, and it was wonderful. And the German lady, the director was German, and his wife did the little catalog for it. And she's like, "So what are you going to do now? You're stuck in Kinshasa. What's next?" And I said, I've always wanted to learn how to weld, and I don't know why.
It's a macho thing.
It's a macho thing, maybe. I don't know, but it's like, funny enough, my things aren't that macho. I mean, there's like a feminine side to it too. Whereas, so she's like, you gotta meet Eddie Bikulu, and he's an amazing Congolese artist. And she's like, go to this corner. He welds, and So we met. He's like my brother, and I've helped him out, and he helped me out, and we found, we built another studio. We worked on together, and then he would, we'd do other things. And so like I started to do it, and then I would sell the little candlestick things, welding. And so it was found objects, and then from the plantations, I would go to these, also, or the factories like Abandoned Tire Factory where, collected different metal pieces. And like, I was like, put things together, whereas he is a real metal bender. I mean, you've seen his work, and it's just like he can bend it and form it like it's just gorgeous. But it was wonderful, beautiful. And so now here, I'm either going to continue the welding, or because we're just like a lot of transition, and or continue doing found art.
It seems to me too, it's about pace. Because
and it slows down now.
Your 10-year hustle pace, probably worked you over like it does everybody, right?
Yeah,
and so the Equator book was saying, I don't want to be at that pace anymore.
Yeah.
I want something more thoughtful, more personal at my own pace.
Exactly.
And now the sculpture and the welding, because you might work on a piece for months and months and months at a time. Because some of these are, just to give people an idea, you have a seahorse that's in your living room that's probably 3 feet tall.
Yeah.
And then you've got a seahorse in your office that's probably 8 feet tall.
Right.
And it's probably 4 feet wide, and it has just all kinds of metal parts and pieces in together. So a piece like that might take how long to put together?
Like 5-6 months.
Yeah, that's a lot different than hitting the shutter button.
Right. No, totally different.
Yeah.
But it's meditative as well. It's methodical. It's a wonderful, when you start welding, it's a total different. I love it. It's a different.
And you think that's the track you're going to stay on?
I don't know. I really don't know. I have no idea. So then I found my first house in 55 years and remodeled the bathrooms. I'm like being very domesticated.
Yeah, you're a normal person.
But the contractor's like, I like your design. You did this. You pulled this off in like 3 months. He's like, that's crazy. He's like, we got to work together. And so I'm like, well, maybe I should become an interior designer. He's like, what would you call it? I'm like, well, maybe mocha design, because mocha was what in high school they called me Swiss mocha, because my roommate was. Her father worked for General Foods, and that was that powdered form, the Swiss mocha.
Swiss Miss Instant Cocoa.
Whatever, totally.
Yodel AEO. That was like the little yodeler person on the ad.
That.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
So I'm like, well, maybe mocha, and anyways, but spelled like in the French version, MOKA. And in Thailand, all the feminine ending of every word is ka, like mocha. Like, I don't know. I'm playing around. Who knows?
I think it could
be anything. Who knows
anything.
What's the next thing?
And my mother told me when I was little, tomorrow we go to my hometown. I haven't been there since I was in 4th grade.
Yeah.
And just south of the hometown, there is a little restaurant that we used to go to as a family. And my mom said that every time they would take me to the restaurant, I would just disappear and I would end up eating at someone else's table. And they would have to go find me and I could be out in the parking lot. And I was little. And she said, you just constantly were on the move out. And my mom said, look, half of our family has wheels for feet. And they're never, and she said, I knew from the time you were a little kid that you were going to leave as soon as you could. And so I think with you, based on the pattern that we've seen so far in your life, there's never, and even last night we were talking about like this, what else is out there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, because we originally were going to go to Uruguay. We really were set on going to South America. And then COVID and whatnot, and I knew the school here because that's where I went to school. And so we decided on. So my Belgian husband is a little fish out of water, but at least we have 4 acres and he has lots of trees around him.
And the dog, who I can see right now tearing around outside.
So yeah, it'll be an interesting time. We've already been here 2 years, but it's been a weird 2 years, like kind of pre-post, during COVID and just, like slowing down and like things didn't come from the Congo. I mean, they were like, our stuff was in transition for like 8 months and almost a year. So going from an apartment to a house. And so I think once the dust settles, then I'll probably move it again, rearrange it.
Yeah, I have a sinking suspicion that the next time I see you could be, I don't know where. We get out the globe and spin.
Yeah, totally. I love that. That's why, I just get a dartboard and, throw a dart and be like, okay, we're going to go here.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time to do this. This was great. It's always fun to catch up, and I learned a ton of things about you that I didn't know, and I'm sure there's a million other things that we didn't get to, but it's a pretty crazy conversation to have a talk with you because it's so worldly, international, interesting, layered, kind of a curious thing. So I appreciate it, and I know that everybody's going to love hearing this.
I appreciate the time, too.
And if someone wants to see your work, where can they find it?
On the website, moniquestauder.com, Stauder.
All right. Well, I look forward to seeing you in a welding mask.
Yes.
And thanks again.
Yep. You're welcome. Bye.